not sure how... Ah, yes, I have to lean slightly forward. Is it still audible like this? Good, okay. I've just got to switch around to my presentation. I made a few changes. There we go. Yeah, one of the nice things about speaking at this kind of conference is you can pinch ideas from people that have just spoken before. So the reason that I changed some of my slides is because Jay Cross, far better than I, said some of the things I was going to say, so I cut some out. Clive has just done a bit of an intro, and he's introduced some of the things I was going to say, so I'm going to skip over them. So, so I'm only going to be a couple of minutes, and then you can... So anyway, yeah, my interest is in cultivating creative approaches to learning design, okay? And I'm interested in all sorts of aspects of design. I'm defining it quite broadly. It's about fashioning from plans. It's about turning ideas into blueprints. I'll just see if I can get this pointer moving. Hang on. There we go. It's about systematic approaches and that kind of thing. I'm also interested in looking at design as an extensive activity. Now, typically in a performance improvement process, assuming you can define one clearly, design is this little bit in the middle, and I don't think it is. I actually think design goes all the way through. So right from the very first hunch that you've got a problem, to the delivery, to the implementation, and so on, I'm including all that in design. I'm also saying that we're talking about communities, games, network simulations, performance support, courses, blogs, wikis, the whole thing. I'm looking at design very broadly. So I'm trying to direct myself away right from the start from saying, okay, I design e-learning courses. I'm trying to get away from that. And obviously they all link together. I'm interested in all aspects of design processes. Who are the people that design? What are the values and beliefs? Do you know, values and beliefs around design are one of the fundamental things that I think that we're going to have to shift, basically. Okay, so why am I that bothered about design? Why is it sort of the driver of my interest in my research and my work? Well, firstly, I think that there's a lot of that's a kind of an agenda in the e-learning industry, both buyers and suppliers, which is about efficiency, not innovation. Okay, we seem set on trying to do the same things that we did last year or 5 years ago, but quicker and cheaper. Instead of saying, you know, there's a kind of frisson of innovation on the top of the industry, but instead of saying, well, let's do something new, let's do things that are more effective, and maybe we need to spend the same amount of money and create value. So there's this kind of efficiency agenda, which I think is something that doesn't serve us very well. And secondly, particularly at conferences like this one, we hear a lot of the what question. The what question is, what should we design? Should we design blogs? Should we design wikis? Should we design courses? That's the what question. You see, I think if you get the how question right, then the what question will look after itself. And the how question is, how do we design? Yeah, one leads to the other. Okay. So a few years ago, I started looking at the design practice of other design disciplines, product designers particularly, architects, interior designers, packaging designers, and I did one project with designer of funfair rides, which was very interesting. And my kind of premise, my starting point was, what can we learn from these other design disciplines that we might be able to do differently, that we could benefit from? Okay. And most of this presentation, actually most of my work, is driven by the insights that I've got from this research. To start with, I'm going to characterize how I see instructional design, learning design. If you're trained as an instructional designer, this is something Clive touched on a minute ago. If you're trained as an instructional designer, you enter kind of flowchart jungle. You get hit with months and months of this stuff, and it's all scientific and robust and engineering-like, and step-by-step and bit-orientated. Yeah? And they try and make it sound as hard and complicated as possible. Actually, it kind of boils down to that. Most learning design processes are in a number of stages. It could be 5 stages. I recently did a workshop where we looked at 7 stages. But basically, you define something, you outline, you design the detail, you make and deploy something, and you evaluate. And sometimes you click wrong and go all crazy. There we go. And you find a lot of this kind of stuff. When closely examined, good instructional systems design is more engineering than art, because this kind of linear block-like sectional process is very engineering orientated. Okay. And traditional learning design practice is very good if you assume that you're thinking in a kind of linear way and that design occurs in discrete blocks. And a fundamental assumption is that you can fully understand the problem you're facing right at the beginning, because you know this obsession, you're probably familiar with this obsession with low-level learning objectives. You know, we must have learning objectives, smack, you know. That assumes you understand what you're doing to start with, doesn't it? This kind of work is built on the values of neatness, predictability, analysis, logic, efficiency, clarity, and it's very sponsor, organization, designer focused. It doesn't focus quite so much on users. And that's fine if, excuse me a minute, the kind of thing you're trying to solve is simple. You know, you're not doing a major change, it's not a difficult change, you've got motivated learners. You can get your head around the problem to start with. You know, you're working in a stable organization environment like we all do. You really, you know, you've got all these very consistent learners like we all have. And above all, you've tackled problems just like this one before. Because that's what these engineering approaches are really good at. Yeah? And there are quite a few problems around like this, and the current way we do things, that's fine, but I don't think they're the ones that matter. You know, this is why I'm kind of connecting with what Jay Cross was saying a little while ago. The kind of problems that the old ways of doing things are good at dealing with aren't the big problems we handle. So if you're producing another supermarket, or another conservatory, or you're designing, you know, a front cover for another romantic novel, you can design just like you're always used to. And this is the bit I can skip because of Jay Cross. I've cut out a few slides here. But, you know, there's loads of models, writers, academics that talk about everything changing. Look, here's one by an academic guy called Regaluth, and he says, look, these are all changing. This is how things used to be. I'm not going to dwell on this now. This is how things are. And just as Clive expressed, he said, you know, this is my model that I've used a fair bit. He said, you know, there was a time not so long ago when we had very few options as designers. That's this bit here. And we knew what the design constraints were. Design constraints are the things that you've got to chuck into your design bucket when you start thinking about your solution. And we had very few constraints. But this is how the world is now. We have huge options, and we don't know what the constraints are. If I asked you right now, how many of you in this audience fully understand the technology infrastructure in your organization, I suspect not many of you would be able to say, yeah, it's fine, yeah, absolutely. But it's a key design constraint, and it didn't used to be. Yeah, it used to be the size of the room, or how many chairs you could get hold of, you know. So this was my characterization in summary of instructional learning design as it used to be. And actually it's a characterization of the kind of the values and attitudes that underlie instructional design. Now, very deliberately and a bit provocatively, and incidentally, this is not one of my occasional rants, isn't my blog. I'm trying to behave. You look at a lot of other designers, you look at architects, you look at product designers, and you actually find they're at the opposite end of each of these key spectrums. So, you know, when you go to design school, one of the things you're taught, can't get the pointer moving, there you go, is that you can't understand the problem to start with because it's too complicated. You have to start designing, and that'll show you what the problem is. Yeah? You're also taught, and this is really common in architecture and product design, you can't work in linear stages because the stages all blur and overlap and whir around each other. You can't do that. It doesn't work. And the kind of values that you live your life and work around are messiness, exploration, intuition balanced with analysis, fuzziness and play. And above all, design is about people. It's about users. Okay? So it's quite interesting that you've got this set of spectrums. So I characterize this divergence as, at one end of the spectrum, engineering, which is all about reliability and solving familiar problems, and design, which is all about innovation. Now, I'm not making any value judgments here. I'm not saying this is a terrible, bad thing to do. If that's the kind of problem you're dealing with, that's fine. What I'm saying is, most of the stuff that we deal with is at this end. And this has gone completely wrong. And this kind of dichotomy, this kind of divergence is not unusual. There's a great little article about 3M. You know, 3M is one of the great innovation companies over the last few decades. It's a nice little article about how when they started improving structured ways to developing things, they lost all their innovation. Okay? And I thought I'd pinch this from Jay's presentation. You know, what humans can't engineer, evolution can. Because what a lot of this sort of design thinking and design values are about are, I don't know what the words are, evolutionary approaches to design, not engineering structured ones. Okay. And here's my big slide. So, You know, I spent 10 minutes trashing things. That was actually, it was a bit like an occasional rant. So I've set myself up now, and I'm saying, right, okay, so I've got an answer. Here's the answer, folks. And of course, I don't have an answer. I've got a number of kind of tips, practical responses to that how question. How can we design in order to cope with the kind of problems that we now face, the learning problems we face? And so here's just a list of areas to think about. I'm not going to be able to do the last one because I'm already talking too long. So that's what I'm going to talk about. And they're deliberately aimed at being pragmatic and useful, okay? So I'm suddenly jumping down a level here. Okay, the first one is about specification versus prototyping, based on the work of Michael Schrager, who wrote a brilliant book called Serious Play. It's a great read, and it's very interesting. It's all about prototype-driven cultures. Now, you look at a typical e-learning development process, and again, I'm getting away from courses here, any type of e-learning development. And what you do is something like this. You have, at the beginning, you have some kind of specification, and you nail down what it is you're going to make. And then about halfway through the project, you start prototyping. And you make the prototype, and you show it to a couple of stakeholders. You never show it to users, incidentally. And they say, yes, that's okay. We've got a few changes. And of course they say that because they've kind of helped do the specification, all right? Now, what is remarkable when you look at lots of other design disciplines is they do this. They go, blimey, we've just got a brief, let's make something, right? And the reason they do that is because what they want from their users, who are the first people to see the prototype, what they want are for the users to say, do you know what, we've got some great ideas. We think that prototype is a pile of rubbish, but we've got some fantastic ideas for you, right? And they give them for free. And actually, I've chopped up the little blue block there, because actually what happens is you do lots of little prototypes, starting with an absolutely rubbish, embarrassing one, and ending up with one which is kind of okay. And quite often, you have this kind of little spec phase in the middle, and sometimes we don't even have that, because you've started making something, you know, and you're away. And the reason you do that is because it's fairly obvious, really, when you think about it. Making something real that works, you know, it could be a paper prototype, it could be a PowerPoint, it could be, like in architecture, it's all models, and in product design, it's models as well. You know, it gives you something to base your ideas around. It gives stakeholders a way of forming opinions. Common mental models, that's a kind of Ponzi way of saying, you know, you have a whole vision, a common vision of things. Making a prototype is also a great way of analysing something. If you make something and give it to a user and say, I know you've got a problem, do you think that solves it? And they go, no. My problem is really this, okay? So it's a great way of analysing learner needs. And of course, it's a great source of ideas. Here's an architectural theorist, Brian Lawson. He says, first decide what might be an important aspect of the problem, do a quick, crude design, examine it, and see what else you can discover. Okay? Very common in architecture. Great book, How Designers Think. Okay, so difference between what I call standard prototyping and early prototyping is that the old way of doing things is controlled and it's part of a linear process. The early prototyping is all about exploration. I'm going to skip through these quite quickly. Beginning of the process. Oh, sorry. So old-fashioned prototyping right in the middle, early prototyping right at the start. But then, of course, you say, well, let's just reflect briefly on this one. The old way of doing things assumed that learning design was all about sectional processes. What part of the process is this? If you start an early prototype, what are you doing? Building, designing, analysing? What is it? I don't know. It's just prototyping. Okay, quick skip through the chart. Early prototyping is about challenging. It's deliberately messy. It's about producing things that are broken because you're going to fix them later. And in case, I'm just going to sort of really hammer this point home. It's absolutely normal in all of these other design disciplines to do this. It's absolutely normal. And if you read Schrager, he says one of the reasons the Japanese car industry got so far ahead was because they had a different view of prototyping. Now, when I was writing this presentation, I thought, hang on, the audience is going to think I've gone down to ever such a low level of detail here. Why am I talking? And the reason I'm banging on about prototyping is because it really represents, it kind of coalesces so many of these values, attitudes, methods, problems that I think the old ways represent. So, it's all about cultures and values. It's just not about process. And there's this guy, David Kelly, from IDEO, who are one of the big innovation design organizations around the world. And he says that we need to move from specification-driven cultures to prototype-driven cultures, because prototype-driven cultures are better able to innovate. Okay? So it's a big deal. It might seem a little thing, where do you put your prototype? But I think it's a big deal. Okay. How am I actually doing for time? Because we didn't start bang on. How long have we got?
Yeah, you've got another 5 minutes.
Okay. I kind of wanted more than 5 minutes, but there we go. So what shall I focus on? Okay. When you go to instructional design school, you're told that those orange bits are where you should use learners. Having studied huge numbers of projects, actually I've discovered that that's where most people use learners. You just, in the prototyping bit. So I did a review. Actually, I've used the word studied there. It's not studied. I reviewed 32 e-learning projects of various types. I found that only 4 had any contact or significant contact with users before the project was halfway complete, which meant, of course, that we'd done all the analysis, the high-level design, the scripting, we'd made a chunk of stuff, and then we finally showed it to users and we said, is that okay? Now, on the other hand, I've been involved in lots of processes where you use real people, users, learners, throughout the whole thing. You can use them to outline the solution. You can use them to design your interfaces for you. I wish this pointer would hurry up. You can get them to write scripts. I've done that. So what I'm saying is we need to use people more, users more, and we need to get contact with them because they'll give you their ideas for free. I'm going to have to go a little bit quicker now. This guy, senior designer in a design agency, says the most naive novice designer would proceed very far without deeply using users. Okay, so I bang on about user-centered design all the time, and people say, in our projects you can't do that because it takes too long. Okay, so the evidence is that user-driven processes are shorter and cheaper. And there's lots of research to back that up. Have a look at that link, Flow Interactive. Typically what happens is this. Here's our standard project, effort time. At the beginning of the project, there's lots of effort. Towards the end, there's a little bump there. And then towards the end of your project, it tails off and takes ages to finish. Oh dear, it takes ages to finish. Because, of course, you've got so many bugs to fix, because you didn't ask the users what they really needed. And the evidence is that with user-driven processes, that happens. And you have shorter, more manageable, cheaper projects. Loads of evidence for it. And, of course, we live in the era of user-generated content. And what these sites and the million others have done that cultivate user-driven content is they've trained people to get used to managing media, managing interfaces. That's what they've done for us. So many of our users, and we're not talking about 18-year-old spotty youths anymore, we're talking about 35-year-old female middle managers, they know how to do this. And yet we consistently don't ask them. Okay? That was going to be a little animation. I'm going to hurry on. So my third point. First point was about prototyping. Second point was about user involvement. Third point is about action. And you probably picked this up already, so I'm going to skip this pretty quick. Ready, fire, aim. Some enterprises are so heavy on the aiming that they miss the target. Huge amount of work being done at the moment in the mainstream, what you might call the coding, the mainstream software development area, around rapid methodologies. Lots of stuff from academia as well. Donald Schoen, you might have heard of him. He says design is a conversation. Yeah, you try stuff out, you see what works, you change it. So spiral methodologies are very important now, very common in mainstream software development. So in other words, you try stuff out, you test it with users, you see what the problems are, you go around. It's a very business-focused way of doing things. And of course, we live in the era of rapid tools. So these days, this is Stephen Walsh from Kineo, these days it's actually just as quick sometimes to make something that almost works than to specify what you were going to make. So why don't you just make it? Yeah? All right, one more point. The old way of doing things was very bits orientated. It was very parts orientated. It was very good at looking at the low-level stuff. But that can lead to losing sight of business and organizational problems. I've had loads of conversations, some of the formal interviews I did with instructional designers. They were fantastic in addressing specific learning objectives, but they had no idea what the organizational problem was they were dealing with. It's quite common. That's what the old ways lead to. They also, spiral methodologies again, they also have creator-sidal tendencies, creator-sidal. That means as in killing creativity. It's not my term. It's a term invented by Guy Claxton and Bill Lucas. The trouble is with being obsessed with bits of things is you kind of lose sight of the big ideas. So what I work with people to do is try and figure out what the big idea is. And again, what you find when you work with professionally trained designers is they're really good at skipping up and down levels. Yeah, they're very good at looking at the bits and then connecting them to a vision. That's kind of part of the training. Another academic, a guy called Dunn, he talks about primary generators, key ideas, ideas that bind things together. So I look at lots of projects. Oh, sorry, I'm going to trivialize my point terribly here. Here's a few buildings, okay? And the core ideas are it's got curves, the staircases are outside, everything's outside, and it's falling over. Okay, so I'm trivializing my point, but the point is, designers tend to be driven by big ideas, by things that bind together all the bits and make sure they work. Okay, this is what I experience particularly from blended projects. We have a business organizational problem, and we're going to chuck all the bits at it. All right? And this is how I think it should work. We have a learning strategy. Now, that's a confusing term. I don't have time to explain it now. But it's a kind of idea around things can coalesce. And this learning strategy is based on principles of learning. And it's that causes people to change and solves the business problem. And here's a little section from a learning strategy from a very successful program, an award-winning program. It says, this is just a little phrase from the learning strategy document. This is emotive case-based learning. I won't go into what that is, emotive case-based learning. It was an explicit statement. And something you'll find when you walk around design agencies is they put these things on the walls like mission statements. They have these big visuals boards. I even worked with one architect who had T-shirts. This was in America, so forgive them. They had T-shirts and baseball caps printed with the blueprint of the building on that they were designing, so they could never forget what the big vision was. Okay? So why don't we? You know, if we're doing emotive case-based learning, let's print emotive case-based learning T-shirts and have our designers wear the blasted things, because then we won't forget what the vision is. And if you think this is pie in the sky, this is the Gold Award-winning course produced by Line Communications, last year's Brandon Hall. It's for the MOD. It's all about cultural awareness. It's a cracking program. I had to remove the judges' quotes just last night, because apparently we don't have permission to use them. But one of the judges said, I could not find fault with this program. I've never given 10 out of 10 for every aspect in any piece of e-learning ever before. It did everything right. I think I'm breaking the convention even showing the words it did everything right. But, and I firmly believe the reason it did everything right is because it was incredibly tightly bound around a common vision, which was this notion of emotive case-based learning. Okay, I'm going to skip over this bit. It's all about, of course, it's all about personality profiles. The idea here is that if you are in this world of a cyclical, fuzzy, non-phased approach to learning design, you have to find the right people who are willing to do that. And what you'll find is if you analyze the personality profilers of professional designers, that they are typically of one or two Myers-Briggs types. But I'm going to skip over that. If you want to have a chat about that later, that's fine. So I'm just going to finish by saying, once again, I'm not saying the engineering, the old-fashioned approach is wrong. I'm just saying that it may be inappropriate for some of the highest value problems that we face. And you have a choice as to where you put yourself on these spectrums. And that needs to be a conscious choice, because design is about conscious choices. And I'll just finish with a corny remark. If you keep doing what you always did, you'll keep getting what you always got. Thank you very much.